Okay, so today we're diving into some pretty interesting stuff. We're looking at legal challenges, the kind that the Trump administration faced really early on.
Yeah, in its very first months.
And we're basing this whole deep dive on a transcript we got. It's from The Ring of Fire on YouTube.
Right. And let me tell you, it paints a striking picture. I mean, right off the bat, the thing that jumps out is this finding that within, I think it was about 2 months, give or take, of the administration taking office, so we're talking mid-January to mid-March.
Of some year, yeah, they do.
They don't specify the exact year. But anyway, during that short period, they identified over a dozen instances where Donald Trump or someone in his administration might have acted outside the law. Potentially, at least.
More than a dozen times in just 2 months.
A lot. It's a lot.
And the transcript goes on, it even gives us this surprising statistic saying that on average, it was basically one potential legal issue popping up every 3.5 days. I mean, that's a wild pace, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And that's exactly what the transcript emphasizes, how unusual that frequency is. It actually compares it to other administrations, pointing out that many of them didn't even hit that many legal challenges over their entire terms, let alone in the first couple of months.
Right. That's just unheard of to have that many legal issues right out of the gate. And to back this up, they even bring in this reporting from Aaron Blake at the Washington Post. His analysis also found something similar, around one legal issue every 4 days. So pretty close to that 3.5 day figure.
Yeah, so it's not just, one source saying this. There's actual data to support it.
Okay, so we've definitely established that the sheer number of legal challenges was, significant. But now let's get into the specifics. What were these alleged violations all about?
Well, the transcript lays out several key areas. They mention efforts to freeze federal funding, like actually stopping the money from going out. Then there's the firing of federal workers. And then initiatives to restrict diversity efforts. Oh, and the proposal to change birthright citizenship, which is a huge deal.
Yeah, that's a core part of the 14th Amendment, right? It's been the law of the land for a long time.
Exactly. And it's got strong legal precedent. Then the transcript talks about moves to limit transgender rights and deporting certain immigrants without, what judges considered proper legal review.
So it's not just one narrow area, it's all over the place.
It really is a broad spectrum. And, in a lot of these cases, the courts actually stepped in and said, hold on, this doesn't look legal. A lot of times they issued injunctions. Those are like temporary halts to stop the administration from doing something while the full case works its way through the courts.
So they were saying, stop what you're doing right now while we figure this out.
Exactly. And what's interesting is, the transcript points out that a lot of the judges used really strong language. They were calling the administration's actions blatantly illegal in some cases. Not just questionable, but way over the line.
Blatantly illegal. That's a pretty serious statement coming from a judge.
Right. It gives you a sense of how the courts were viewing these actions.
So we have this massive number of alleged violations, judges saying they're clearly illegal, and then
Well, then the transcript brings up an even bigger concern. It talks about the administration maybe not actually following court orders. What happened there?
yeah, this is where things get really dicey. The transcript moves from the legal challenges themselves to the administration's response, or lack thereof, to these court rulings.
And the big example they give is that repeated attempt to freeze federal funding.
Right.
The judges kept saying, unfreeze the funds, sometimes even do it today, but apparently the administration wasn't always listening.
Right. And then there's this whole thing with Carolyn Levitt. She's a lawyer. And she basically tweeted that they were planning to disregard a court order to release funds. And then that tweet, get this, was used in court as evidence that they weren't complying.
Oh, wow. So they used her own words against her.
It's wild, right? It led to another court order demanding action. I mean, this is serious stuff. The courts issue these orders, they're supposed to be binding, and then the administration just ignores them. I mean, what does that even mean for the rule of law, What's the point of having courts if the executive branch can just do whatever it wants?
That's the big question, isn't it? And the transcript really hammers that home. It's worried about the court's ability to hold the executive branch accountable. What happens if they issue orders and those orders are just routinely ignored?
The transcript mentions the idea of holding people in contempt of court, which could then lead to presidential pardons. That just makes things even more complicated.
Right. And it also talks about executive immunity, which is this idea that the president has some protection from being sued for things they do as part of their job. Now, the transcript doesn't get into the specifics of any particular ruling, but the point is clear. If the executive branch isn't bound by the law, that undermines the whole idea that nobody is above the law.
Right, regardless of their position, everyone has to answer to the law. That's a fundamental principle. But it seems like in this case, there was a real struggle to enforce that accountability.
It's like this clash between the principle and the reality. The transcript shows that a lot of legal lines were being crossed, and then the administration's response to those challenges was, well, concerning, to say the least.
Yeah, it's not just one incident, it's a pattern of behavior. All these legal challenges and then this alleged disregard for court orders all happening right at the beginning of the administration. It really makes you wonder about their approach to legal authority in general.
It's definitely a lot to unpack, and it raises a lot of important questions. So, for our listeners out there, what's the big takeaway from this whole deep dive? I think it's safe to say that this transcript shows an administration facing a huge number of legal challenges in its early days, and then potentially even resisting the rulings against it.
Exactly. And if we look at the bigger picture, it makes you think about the long-term consequences for our whole system of government. What happens if this kind of behavior becomes the norm? What happens to the balance of power between the different branches? Can the rule of law really function if court orders are just ignored?
These are not easy questions, but they're important ones. It forces us to think about the role of the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and all the ways they're supposed to hold each other accountable, and whether those mechanisms are working or whether they need to be strengthened.
It's a lot to consider. And for you listening, I think the big question is, what are the lasting effects on our system of government when the executive branch repeatedly faces this kind of legal scrutiny and then potentially disregards the rulings? It really challenges us to think about the strength of our institutions and what the limits of executive power should be.
This deep dive, based on this Ring of Fire transcript, really gives us a close-up look at a very specific moment in time, a time when the executive branch was under immense legal pressure. It shows us the sheer volume of legal challenges they were facing, and it raises some serious concerns about how they were responding to those challenges. It's definitely a period worth thinking about, especially as we see these same themes playing out today.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that these issues of legal accountability and the balance of power are ongoing and constantly evolving. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and keep those questions in mind as you continue to explore these complex and fascinating topics.